So we have got the Sony a7C here, the brand new full frame camera. It's not part of any existing ranges. It sits alongside things like the a7R4, the a7S III now, which we talked about the other day, the a7 III as well. And the C in the name, obviously, as you can probably see from the camera itself, stands for compact. This is definitely the compact, small, lightweight range. So it's a full frame camera, a lot of the same functionality as the a7 III, actually really nice to shoot with, but in the body, which is about the size and weight of something like the a6400, the a6600, something like that. Now, I've been shooting with it, I've had it for about 24 hours, so not super loads of time, but I have been out pretty much the whole time shooting with it. It's been good weather, fortunately, and I've been using the new lens, which has been announced as well. So 28 to 60mm zoom lens, f4 to 5.6, so not the brightest lens, but as you can see, it is very, very small, and it fits super nice on the front of this camera. So as a kit, this is very lightweight. This is very compact. It's perfect for stuff like travel, everyday use. Someone who wants a good full frame camera but doesn't want to have anything too big. Not that things like the a7 III are particularly big, but you can see from the system, this is just easy to put. You could put this in your bag. It doesn't have to be a camera bag. Just pop it in your normal rucksack or anything like that. Now, I've been shooting with it, like I say, for pretty much the whole day. I've been using this lens a lot. I've also used the 24 to 70 G Master and the 85 G Master because I just wanted to make sure that they felt okay on the front of this camera, because obviously it's quite small and lightweight, as we mentioned about 100 times now. I wanted to make sure those big lenses didn't feel too front heavy. And obviously they are a little bit, because there's just no getting around that. They are quite big lenses, but actually it didn't feel bad at all. I have quite big hands, so maybe that's part of it, but it really didn't feel like a problem at all, the weight balance between the camera and the lens. So there's a few things to talk about. Let's start off with some of the specs, and then we can get into the way it looks, because you've probably noticed the silver design on the top. We'll get into that, the feel of it, and all of the stuff that I've been doing with it. We can talk about all of that. But first of all, let's just talk about some of the specs so we know where we're sitting here. It's very, very similar to the a7 III. I shoot with the a7 III all the time, so this was incredibly easy to just jump into. It felt like shooting with a small a7 III, really. But jumping into the specs, it's 24.2 megapixel back illuminated sensor, which you'd probably expect from something like this. It's got the new Bions X processor, so the same processor, I think, as the a7R4, which is actually noticeably quite fast and snappy with the menus and things like that. And it does mean as well that you get that nice eye tracking in video, you get the real-time tracking, all that kind of stuff, which is really, really nice. 15 stops of dynamic range, and it does seem to perform really quite well in low light. So of course, because I've been shooting with this lens, even though it was in the day, in the forest, the 28 to 60, it's an f4 to 5.6, so it's not the brightest lens in the world, but it does mean that I got the opportunity to crank up the ISO a little bit just to see how that would perform. So shooting at 3200, 6400, no problem for this camera at all. Just seemed to handle it really well. Not that much of a surprise, to be honest. The a7S III was of course superb for that kind of stuff, and even the a7 III is great for low light, so I'm not particularly surprised that this is really good as well. Now, autofocus, no big surprise here, is really, really good. If you've shot with Sony cameras, certainly some of the last few Sony cameras over the last couple of years, it's just ridiculously good. You know, with the eye tracking, you've got eye autofocus for humans and for animals. You've got eye tracking, real-time tracking in video as well. 693 phase detection points, 425 contrast detection points, if you're interested in that kind of thing, but it just works straight away, all the time. It's very, very good, as you'd expect from a Sony camera at this point. When you want to shoot portraits, whether you want to shoot video with a subject, it makes it incredibly easy. Much like the a7 III as well, it'll do 10 frames a second continuous shooting, and that's with autofocus as well. You get about 115 raw photos in the buffer, so not bad at all. So you can definitely get some kind of action shots if you're out doing some traveling or just out and about with this camera. You're definitely gonna be able to capture all kinds of different things with that. Now let's talk about video. Obviously the whole video at the start of this was shot on the a7C, and it films much like the a7 III, so 4K up to 30 frames a second, full HD up to 120 frames a second for that nice slow motion. It's 8-bit video. I think some people might be upset about that, some people might want 10-bit, but I think that was probably a bit ambitious. We just got 10-bit in the a7S III. To be honest, the a7 III shoots 8-bit. I shoot with that all the time, I know lots of people do. I think it's fine, to be honest. It doesn't give you as much room for flexibility for color grade and stuff like that, but I color my footage on the a7 III with no issues at all, really, and it's absolutely the same on here. It's the same feel when you're shooting, and it's absolutely the same feel when you're editing as well. So if you're familiar with that camera, this feels very similar. You've got S-Log in there, HLG, it's 14 stops of dynamic range, which if you've shot with Sony, you know it is actually really quite good for dynamic range. Now, all of those video shots at the beginning of the video, everything I'm putting up now, it's all shot handheld. So everything you're seeing that was shot with this camera is shot handheld. There's a few reasons for that. It's generally how I do things because it's nice and quick, nice and easy. But especially when you have 24 hours of the camera, I don't want to set up a whole gimbal system and be running through the forest with a massive, Ronin or something like that. I'm just going to set up, shoot handheld. Also, as I mentioned in the a7S III video, it's way more useful for me to know how this performs handheld. I know how it's going to perform on a gimbal. It's going to look really smooth because I'm not really testing the camera in that situation, I'm testing the gimbal. Whereas using it handheld, you get to see how it performs and how the image stabilization performs. And that is interesting to me because there's a new image stabilization system in this camera. And part of the reason for that is obviously it's a much smaller camera than something like the a7 III, so it needs a smaller image stabilization system. So that's what Sony have done. They've developed a new system for it. It's 5 stops of image stabilization, and I would say that it performs well. It's not bad at all. It's definitely better than not having anything, and does make handheld shooting easier. That said, it's probably not the best image stabilization that I've ever seen in a camera, but I don't know that I need it to be in such a small camera like this. If you really want to get that super smooth stuff, then I guess pop it on a gimbal, but otherwise, it's useful if you're traveling and you want to get those shots, but I found that I usually use either slow motion to kind of smooth out my footage, or I needed to use a bit of warp stabilizer in Premiere Pro or something like that for the video stuff. And for the photo, actually, it did seem to work pretty well for getting a slower shutter speed. I was able to get down to about 1/40th of a second without any problems at all. So that's quite useful. Okay, so let's talk about the actual camera itself, what it's like to shoot with, what it feels like, things like the viewfinders over here and smaller, the screen, the silver on the top. Let's start there. So the silver on the top, that's obviously going to be a completely personal thing. It's completely subjective. Personally, I like it. I like the look of it. My wife liked the look of it as well when I took it out of the box for the first time. I think it's quite stylish. It makes it stand out. It feels like a little bit of a bold choice from Sony, considering they don't usually go for that sort of stuff. But that is going to be completely subjective. It's entirely up to you whether you like the silver, and I believe it comes in black as well, although I will double check before I leave that in the video. But if it does, which I think it does, it'll all be down in the description so you can check it out for yourself. Otherwise, it feels a lot like something like an a6400 or an a6600 to actually shoot with. Although what I would say is the grip is surprisingly comfortable. And I say that because normally smaller cameras like this, I find a little bit less comfortable to shoot with. Not too bad, but because I've got quite big hands. But actually, my fingers have no issue getting in between the lens and the grip, including when I'm using bigger lenses as well. So the 85mm G Master, the 24-70 G Master, I have no issue getting my fingers in there. So that's an interesting thing actually, because that can be a problem. The grip itself though is deeper than I thought it would be for such a small camera, which makes it easier to carry around, just easier to shoot with in general. So even carrying it around for hours earlier in the forest, just not a problem for me at all. Button placement is quite decent as well. It's relatively ergonomic. It's also relatively sleek in terms of the number of buttons it's got on there. So you've only got a few dials on the top. You've obviously got the program dial, the exposure compensation, record button on the top, which is quite nice actually. Not to have it on the back. It frees up some space on the back just to have it on the top there. And of course the shutter. And then on the back, you've got some controls for things like aperture, shutter speed. So a dial at the top for which I'm using for aperture, and then I'm using the dial at the back for shutter speed. Now, one thing that I wasn't as keen on is there's no joystick on the back. So I often find myself reaching for that. That could be because I'm used to it on an a7 III. I'm used to it on the a7S III we did the other day, but it's not there. So you have to use the D-pad on the circular dial. Is that a big problem? Probably not, but I did find myself missing it a little bit. So let's talk about the viewfinder and the screen. So the viewfinder, first of all, it's relatively small. It's up on the top left of the camera here. I don't normally find that an issue on a compact camera or on an APS-C camera, but here I didn't like it as much as I like the viewfinder on things like the a7 III, obviously the a7S III, which has an incredible viewfinder, the a7R4. With a full frame camera, I personally like to have a nice viewfinder that's going to fit my eye. I found this one a little bit small, so I wasn't a massive fan of that. On the other side though, I do understand that it has to be relatively small to have a compact camera. It's kind of the point. So even though it is full frame, it is designed as a compact camera. So while I'm not the biggest fan of it, it is a necessary thing to keep this camera nice and small and lightweight. Now, in terms of the screen, I was out in probably some of the brightest sun I would normally ever have to shoot in. It was a little bit tricky to see the screen at times because of the sun. You know, it's not the brightest screen I've ever seen, but I really didn't have that much problem with it. And I was using the screen most of the time because I wasn't such a big fan of the viewfinder. Otherwise, it is a touch screen, so I was using it for touch focus and things like that. This was where I missed the joystick a little bit because I was touching to select a focus point and I couldn't use the joystick to then change that focus point, which is a little bit of a shame. However, all of those things, the lack of joystick, the smaller viewfinder, I do totally understand that they're probably a necessary thing, like I said, with the viewfinder, to keep this camera the size it is. And that's the point of this camera. If you don't want to have those things gone and you want to have a bigger viewfinder and all that kind of stuff, then you can actually go for the a7 III and have very much a similar experience, you know, minus a couple of things, but very similar experience from that camera. But if you want the compact full frame camera, so if you're going traveling a lot or you're out and about a lot and you don't want to have a relatively big camera or even a mid-sized camera, you know, an a7 III isn't massive, but if you have that and then a lens on it, it's going to be quite a bit bigger than something like this. So if you want to have that compact experience but retain the full frame quality, it's a no-brainer. This is great. This is a great camera, and there are some trade-offs to have that, but that's because I guess you can't have everything. I guess that's the sad reality. So ultimately, I think it's a really nice camera. I think that it works a lot like the a7 III. If you're used to that camera in any way, you'll be right at home here. It has some great hybrid opportunities for photographers, for videographers. I think it'd be fantastic for content creators because of the size of it, you know, for vloggers, anything like that, but you're going to get that nicer quality from this camera. So I think that is a great opportunity. I really liked the stuff that I was able to shoot in it, both photo and video. And of course, if you're using this smaller lens, it's a very nice compact system, but there's also the opportunity to use some of the bigger lenses that Sony make, and they're very, very nice lenses. If you have something like an a7S III that you're going to get, or an a7R4 that you use for pro work, this would make a really nice camera to have for going traveling, for going out, for taking, you know, on your walks around the park or anything like that. When you don't necessarily want to take your massive photography bag with all these stuff, you could just take this 28 to 60mm lens on the front and no worries. But you're still going to retain that full frame quality. Now, like I say, I spent 24 hours with this camera, so if you have any questions, pop them down in the comments below. I'll do my absolute best to answer them. I have done my best to learn as much as I can about this camera in the time that I've had it, including how it works, how it feels, everything like that. So anything that I've not mentioned in the video, do feel free to pop it down in the comments below. Any questions about editing or anything at all that you want to know about anything to do with this camera, just let me know down in the comments. If you like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe as well. I find that incredibly helpful, and I would take it as a personal favor from you to me if you were to do that. I will of course see you in the next video, and as always, thanks for watching.